The moment Hannah Vale walked into Riverside Federal Medical Center's emergency entrance, 12 federal K9 units broke formation simultaneously. Not one dog. Not two. All 12. They pulled free of their handlers, crossed a crowded ER floor, and surrounded her in a tight, silent circle. Heads low, tails still, eyes locked on her face. The handlers stood frozen. The federal agents reached for weapons they didn't draw. A trauma team stopped mid-procedure to stare through the glass. And Hannah Vale, stuttering, overlooked, the nurse everyone had dismissed for 3 years, stood at the center of it all, her hands trembling at her sides, eyes filling with something that looked a lot like grief. "Who are you?" the federal commander demanded. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Gee, just a nurse," she said. Nobody believed her. If this story already has you hooked, please subscribe to my channel and follow along until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The 6:15 a.m. shift change at Riverside Federal Medical Center was the kind of organized chaos that never fully organized itself. Gurneys rattled through corridors that smelled of floor wax and recycled air. Night nurses handed off clipboards with the hollow eyes of people who had been awake too long. The overhead fluorescents buzzed at a frequency that, after enough years, you stopped hearing. Or at least you told yourself you did. Hannah Vale had been telling herself that for 3 years. She came in through the side entrance every morning, the one near the supply loading dock that most staff avoided because it added 4 minutes to the walk from the parking structure. Hannah used it because it added 4 minutes to the walk. 4 minutes where nobody talked to her, nobody asked her to repeat herself, nobody exchanged that particular sideways look with a colleague, the one that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a wince, but landed somewhere between the two. She was 34 years old, medium height. Brown hair she kept pulled back with the same 2 clips she'd owned for 7 years. She wore her scrubs the way other people wore armor. Functional, unremarkable, deliberately, without statement. Her badge read, Vale H. RN, trauma support, and she had learned over time that if you kept your head at the right angle and moved with enough quiet purpose, you could pass through a busy hospital floor without anyone really seeing you. Most days, that suited her fine. She clocked in, pulled up the overnight notes, and began her first round before the charge nurse had finished her coffee. "Vale." Brianna Marsh called across the station without looking up from her phone. Brianna was the senior charge nurse, 2 years younger than Hannah and about 40 decibels louder in every professional situation. She had a voice that carried from the nurse's station to the trauma bay and a talent for making the word Vale sound like a mild inconvenience. "Room 14 needs a line reset. The night guy said the pump threw an error code." Hannah nodded and picked up the supply kit. "Did you hear me?" "Yes," Hannah said. She was already moving. From behind her, she caught the murmur. She always caught it, not because she was listening for it, but because after 3 years, your ears stop pretending. Why does she even bother? That was Dex, one of the ER techs. Mid-20s, hadn't yet figured out that volume and confidence weren't the same thing. Half the patients ask for somebody else after their first conversation with her. She's good at the technical stuff. That was Carla, a float nurse who meant it as a defense and landed it somewhere short of one. Sure, but you can't really communicate with her, you know? It's exhausting for the patient. Hannah reset the IV pump in room 14 with clean, practiced efficiency. The patient, a 60-something man in post-op recovery, still foggy, opened his eyes when she finished. "You fix it?" he asked. "Yes, sir. You're all set." He closed his eyes again. That was the whole conversation. She had about 800 of them a day, give or take. She was back at the station, updating the chart, when the alert came through the hospital intercom. Not a code. Not a fire drill. A security coordination notice, the kind that went out when a federal agency was bringing personnel into the building and wanted staff to know there would be unusual traffic in the East Corridor. Riverside Federal Medical Center was one of 4 hospitals in the country with a designated federal witness protection wing. It was a small wing, well secured, and most of the time, Hannah's work never intersected with it. She provided trauma support for the general population, the overflow cases, the people who came in through the main ER rather than the government entrance in the back. She noted the alert, filed it in the part of her brain reserved for things that didn't require her direct attention, and moved on to room 17. The federal motorcade arrived at 8:40 a.m. Hannah knew this not because she was watching for it, but because the East Corridor suddenly filled with a specific type of human energy, that concentrated, lockdown alertness that came off federal personnel like a frequency. She'd spent enough years around it to recognize it the way you'd recognize a song you hadn't heard in a long time. Something in your chest tightened before your mind caught up with why. She was changing a wound dressing in the supply anteroom near the East Junction when she heard it. Not voices, not footsteps. Pause. Specifically, the rhythmic, purposeful sound of multiple large dogs moving in coordinated formation on a hard floor. That particular cadence that was different from a pet. Different even from a single working dog. Because there was something almost mechanical about 12 animals moving as one. Hannah set down the gauze package slowly. She didn't go to the window. She had no reason to go to the window. She went anyway. Through the narrow rectangular glass, she could see the East Corridor, and the group coming through it. 8 federal agents in tactical vests, 4 civilian escorts with identification lanyards, and 12 Belgian Malinois in full working gear. The dogs were paired in double columns, leashed but moving with the kind of controlled focus that made you understand the leash was a formality. Hannah stood very still. Her hand was flat against the door frame. She didn't realize she'd reached for it. She was looking at the lead dog. Dark sable coat, slightly larger than the others, a small silver scar running along the left ear. He had his head up in the way working dogs do when they're scanning, not anxious, not excited, just methodically collecting data from the air around him. "Atlas," she said, under her breath, to nobody. The dog was 40 feet behind glass, in a sealed corridor. His head turned. Yum. What happened next did not have a clean explanation. The lead dog stopped walking. The column behind him compressed, not colliding, just stacking up the way a line of people does when the person in front stops without warning. The handler gripped the leash and issued a sharp verbal correction that Hannah couldn't hear through the glass. Atlas did not respond to the correction. His nose was working, rapid and focused, pointed directly at the anteroom door. He took one step sideways, out of formation, and the handler yanked hard on the leash. Then the dog next to him stopped. Then the one behind. Within 6 seconds, all 12 animals had broken from their coordinated column. Their handlers were shouting now. She could hear it even through the glass, overlapping commands that the dogs were simply not responding to, not because they were aggressive or frightened, but because they were all, with absolute unanimity, oriented toward the anteroom door. Hannah took a step back from the window. The lead agent, tall, dark jacket, the kind of composed face that meant he'd been in complicated situations before and had decided composure was the most useful response to all of them, was already moving toward the door. His hand wasn't on his weapon, but she could see the calculation happening. He pushed the anteroom door open, and 12 federal K9 units surged past him. What? They did not knock her down. That was the first thing she registered. That for 12 large, powerful, working breed dogs moving at speed into a small room, they were extraordinarily controlled about it. They formed a loose circle around her. The bigger ones sat. The smaller ones pressed their heads briefly against her legs, her hands, her arms, and then positioned themselves with that same quiet precision that had always made working dogs look, to Hannah, less like animals and more like a different kind of person. Atlas was the last one in. He walked directly to her, sat in front of her, and put his head against her sternum. Hannah pressed her lips together hard. She was not going to do this. Not here. Not in front of a federal agent who was currently standing in the doorway of a hospital anteroom, looking at her like she had just done something impossible. She was not going to fall apart in front of this man. She put her hand on Atlas's head anyway. The dog exhaled. That long, slow, full-body exhale that working dogs did when they'd been carrying something and finally set it down. "Ma'am." The agent's voice was carefully calibrated, professional, not aggressive, not gentle, just precise. "I need you to tell me who you are." Hannah Vale." She kept her eyes on Atlas. It was easier. "I'm a nurse. I work on the trauma support floor." "You have federal clearance?" "I did. It's been inactive for a while." He moved into the doorway properly, not crowding the room but making his presence in it deliberate. Behind him, in the corridor, she could see the other handlers standing with their now unencumbered leashes and expressions that ranged from baffled to deeply unsettled. How do you know these animals? He asked. Hannah hesitated, not because she was deciding whether to answer, but because she was deciding how much of the answer she had the energy for right now, in this room, with this man, on a morning that had already been its own specific kind of exhausting before any of this happened. I used to work with them, she said. A long time ago. Where? She finally looked up at him. Who are you? Agent Cole Mercer, Tactical Coordination, Federal Asset Protection Division. He said it the way people say their name and rank when they've said it 10,000 times. No performance, just information. And I need a more specific answer than a long time ago, Ms. Vale. Keller Recovery and Rehabilitation Facility, she said, outside of Dalton. It was a classified K9 trauma unit. It ran for 5 years under FAPD contract, and then they closed it. Or they restructured it. I'm not sure what they did with it after I left. Mercer was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was running something through his head. How long ago did you leave? 4 years? He looked at the dogs. All 12 of them settled around her in that loose, attentive ring as if they'd been told to stay. These aren't Keller animals, he said. No, Hannah said. But the 5 oldest ones, Atlas, Remy, Juniper, Drake, and Sable. I worked with them at Keller before they were transferred into active units. The younger ones, she moved her hand slightly, and 3 of the younger Malinois oriented toward her immediately. They were trained using the Keller protocol, the behavioral foundation. They've never met me, but they know the method. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. A nurse, he said. Yes. At a federal hospital. Yes. With inactive clearance and K9 behavioral expertise. I'm aware of how it sounds, Hannah said. Her voice was flat. She was very tired of explaining things she hadn't asked to explain. The anteroom cleared out over the next 20 minutes in the controlled, organized way that federal personnel handled unusual situations, methodically, with minimal conversation, and with the specific kind of lateral communication that happened in quick looks and brief hand signals rather than words. The dogs were reattached to their handlers and moved to a staging area. Atlas went last, and when his handler reached for the leash, he looked back at Hannah with that calm, complete attention that she had spent 5 years trying to teach people to understand. He wasn't looking back because he was sad to leave. He wasn't looking back because he was confused. He was checking on her. Hannah put her hand flat against the side of her thigh to stop it from shaking and turned back to the supply shelf. What was that? She closed her eyes briefly before turning around. Brianna Marsh was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, with the expression she used when something had happened that she hadn't been informed of first. The dogs recognized me, Hannah said. I used to work in a K9 rehabilitation program. You used to work with federal dogs? Yes. And you never mentioned this. Hannah picked up the gauze package she'd set down 20 minutes ago. It wasn't relevant. It's relevant now, Brianna said. The federal agents are asking about you. I have the director's assistant calling the station wanting to know who you are and what your clearance level is. My clearance is inactive. I'm a trauma support nurse. That's it. Hannah. Brianna's voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but different, like she was recalibrating something. What is going on? I don't know yet, Hannah said honestly, but I don't think it's about me. That, as it turned out, was not entirely accurate. Director Lowell Ashby ran Riverside Federal Medical Center with the energy of a man who had spent 20 years believing that if he was just organized enough, prepared enough, and connected enough to the right people, then nothing would ever genuinely surprise him. He had a corner office with a view of the east parking structure, a wall of certificates and commendations, and a habit of walking into rooms slightly ahead of the people he was with to establish that the room belonged to him before anyone else could make a claim on it. He walked into the small conference room at 9:15 a.m., ahead of Agent Mercer, ahead of his own assistant, and stopped when he saw Hannah Vale already seated at the table. Ms. Vale, he said, Dr. Ashby. He sat down across from her with the particular deliberateness of a man deciding not to show that anything had surprised him. Mercer took the chair to Hannah's left and opened a slim folder without ceremony. We need to debrief what happened this morning, Mercer said, and we need to do it quickly because the animals are going to be on site for at least 72 hours and their behavioral state directly affects our security posture. Their behavioral state is fine, Hannah said. They're not distressed. They were just responding to a familiar stimulus. You, Mercer said. Me. Or more accurately, the behavioral cues they associate with safe interaction. But I think the more important question is why they're here, not why they reacted to me. Ashby looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at the folder. The K9 units are here as part of a federal witness protection transfer, Mercer said. We have 3 individuals currently housed in the secure wing. The animals are here to provide additional perimeter detection. How long has the team been deployed? 11 days. Hannah frowned. And how are they doing? They're performing within parameters. That's not what I asked. Mercer looked at her directly for the first time since they'd sat down. His expression was the professional blank that she recognized, the one that was genuinely neutral rather than hiding something. And then something behind it shifted slightly. Atlas has been showing some behavioral irregularities, he said. Nothing that's broken protocol, but the behavioral specialist we usually work with is currently deployed overseas and there's been a gap in monitoring, Hannah said. In support, he said. Hannah understood the difference. How long has he been showing irregularities? About 6 days, and nobody flagged it until this morning. It was flagged internally. We were managing it. Managing it and addressing it are different things, Hannah said, and then heard herself and stopped. She pressed the back of her thumb against the edge of the table. She wasn't here to lecture a federal agent on K9 welfare. She was a nurse, a trauma support nurse with inactive clearance and a normal job that she was currently not doing. Ms. Vale, Ashby said carefully, I'm going to need you to walk me through your previous federal employment. For the record. Why? Because 6 federal K9 units broke from formation in my hospital this morning and surrounded a member of my nursing staff, and I'd like to understand what I'm dealing with. Hannah looked at the folder in front of Mercer. She looked at Ashby's careful, professionally composed face. She thought about the 4-minute walk from the parking structure and the side entrance and the way she'd been telling herself for 3 years that the fluorescence didn't bother her. I worked at Keller for 5 years, she said, starting when I was 25. I had a nursing background and a background in animal behavior, and the program was looking for people who could do both. We worked with K9s that had come back from active deployment with trauma, behavioral trauma, physical recovery, sometimes both. The goal was to get them stable enough to re-enter service, or to transition them to civilian placement if they couldn't. And your specific role? Mercer asked. I developed the interaction protocols, the approach that the handlers use now, the low-stimulus introduction, the trust-building sequences, the behavioral mapping system for tracking recovery progress. She said it simply, without inflection, because it was just what had happened. I put most of that together during my first 3 years. The last 2 years I was at Keller, I was also training the trainers. Ashby was very quiet. And then you left, Mercer said. And then I left. Why? Hannah was quiet for a moment. I raised a concern about a deployment decision, an animal that I assessed as not ready for active service. The assessment was overruled, and the dog was deployed, and she stopped. It didn't go well, and I left. The room was quiet. What's the animal's name? Mercer asked. Hannah looked at the folder. Is that relevant right now? No, he said. I just wanted to know. His name was Gideon, she said. He was a good dog. He just needed more time. She was back on the floor by 10 o'clock. Brianna gave her the shift readout and the chart updates without the usual commentary, which Hannah registered as a small and probably temporary adjustment. By noon, 2 other nurses had found reasons to pass by her station and ask questions they could have looked up themselves, which was how curiosity expressed itself in a hospital when people didn't want to admit they were curious. She answered them briefly and moved on. At 1:15 p.m., she was eating lunch alone in the staff lounge, a container of cold pasta she'd made Sunday, a habit, when Agent Mercer appeared in the doorway. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. Do you have a few minutes? I have 11, she said. My break ends at 1:30. He came in and sat down across from her without asking if he could, which she noted but didn't object to. He had a tablet with him. He set it on the table between them. I want to show you something. The tablet showed a behavioral log, time-stamped entries, coded observations, deviation markers. She recognized the format. It was a modified version of the system she'd built, close enough to tell her someone at Keller had continued developing it after she left. She scanned it quickly. Then she scanned it more carefully. "How long has Atlas been doing this?" she asked, pointing to a specific entry pattern. "About 9 days. This isn't just behavioral irregularity," she said. He's detecting something. He's been trying to signal something for 9 days and the people around him haven't been reading it correctly." "What do you mean detecting something?" Hannah set down her fork. "Working dogs don't have anxiety spirals the way humans do. When they show irregular alert behavior, especially sustained over multiple days, in a contained environment with no new stimuli, it usually means the stimulus isn't new. It means something in the environment has been there long enough that the dog has been trying to mark it and isn't being read." Mercer was very still. "Where exactly is Atlas stationed?" Hannah asked. He told her. She looked at the behavioral log again. "The pattern peaks between 2 and 4 p.m., she said. "The East Service Corridor, your maintenance window." A pause. "We have routine maintenance personnel access from 2 to 4 every afternoon." "How long has that been the schedule?" "About 12 days. Hannah put the lid back on her pasta container. Her lunch break was not going to finish the way it had started. "Agent Mercer," she said, "I think you need to look very carefully at who has been walking through that service corridor every afternoon for the last 12 days. He was already reaching for his radio. The call went out at 1:23 p.m. By 1:27, the hospital had locked down its East Service access. By 1:31, a man in a maintenance uniform with a badge that matched no employee in the hospital's system had been stopped in Corridor 7 with a sidearm, 2 sets of stolen credentials, and a floor plan with 3 rooms circled in red ink. Hannah was still in the break room when she heard the alert. She sat very still for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her cold pasta in front of her. Outside the window of the staff lounge, she could see the east parking structure. She could see very faintly the reflection of emergency lights beginning to move. She thought about Atlas, about the way he'd looked back at her when his handler reached for the leash, checking on her. She had told herself it was about the dogs, not about her. And in the most important way, that was still true. But Atlas had been trying to tell someone something for 9 days, and the only person in this building who had understood him had spent 3 years taking the side entrance. Hannah picked up her fork. She had 4 minutes of lunch left, and the floor wasn't going to run itself. And somewhere in the east wing of this hospital, a federal security situation was unfolding that she had helped prevent without anyone yet realizing that was what had just happened. Her hand was steady now. That was the thing about working dogs. They didn't care how long it took you to speak. They cared whether you were paying attention. She had been paying attention for a very long time. At 2:04 p.m., Brianna Marsh found her at the trauma station. "There are federal agents asking for you again," Brianna said. Her voice had lost its usual edge. Not soft, just different in a way that Hannah didn't yet know how to categorize. Hannah finished the notation she was writing. "Did they say why?" "No." Brianna paused. "Hannah, what is happening?" Hannah looked up. Brianna Marsh had worked beside her for 3 years. She had exchanged the sideways look with Dex and with Carla and with 6 other people whose names Hannah knew. She had called across the station without looking up from her phone. She was looking at Hannah now. "I'm not entirely sure," Hannah said honestly, "but I think it's going to take a while to explain." She set down her pen and walked toward the east corridor, and behind her she heard Brianna say nothing, which was, in its own way, the most complicated thing the woman had said to her in 3 years. The federal staging area was set up just inside the secure perimeter, past a checkpoint that Hannah was waved through after 30 seconds of a guard checking her badge against a list that, until this morning, she had not been on. Mercer was there. Beside him, a woman Hannah didn't recognize, senior rank from the way the others were positioned around her, and a man in his 60s with silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting. The man looked at Hannah. Something in his expression fractured, just slightly, just for a moment, the way ice shifts before it breaks. "Hannah," he said. She stopped walking. "Director Vale," she said. Marcus Vale, federal director, former head of the Keller program, and the reason she had walked out of a classified facility 4 years ago and never looked back, extended his hand. She didn't take it. "I owe you an explanation," he said. You owe me considerably more than that, she said quietly. But we can start there. Marcus Vale had not changed as much as she'd expected. That was the thing about people who carried authority like a second skeleton. It held them upright even when everything else was shifting. He was older, obviously. The silver in his hair had gone from distinguished to complete, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 4 years ago. But the stillness was the same. The way he occupied a room without appearing to try was the same. The careful, measured quality of his attention, the thing that had made her trust him once, was entirely unchanged, which made it harder, not easier. You owe me considerably more than that, she said quietly. But we can start there. Marcus lowered his hand. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked like a man who had been rehearsing something and had arrived at the moment where the rehearsal ended and the actual thing began, and had discovered that the actual thing was harder than the rehearsal. Can we sit down? He asked. I'd rather stand. He nodded once. Fair enough. The man they detained this afternoon, his name is Terrence Boyle. He's a contractor connected to a group that's been working to compromise a federal witness housed in the secure wing. The witness is scheduled to testify in 8 days. Marcus paused. Atlas had been flagging his access pattern for over a week. The behavioral reports were submitted to the Regional Coordination Office. They were reviewed. The conclusion was that Atlas was experiencing deployment fatigue. Hannah absorbed that. Deployment fatigue. Yes. In a low-stimulus hospital environment with no change in team or handler, no mission stress, no environmental trauma triggers. I understand what you're thinking. I'm thinking that whoever reviewed that report has never spent an hour with a working dog in their life, Hannah said. The words came out flat and clean, not angry, which was somehow worse than anger. I'm thinking that you had 9 days and you missed it. We missed it, Marcus said. Yes. The woman beside him, the one Hannah didn't recognize, had been quiet through this entire exchange. She was perhaps 50, with cropped dark hair and the kind of face that processed information and revealed none of it. She spoke now. I'm Deputy Director Sloan Ferris. I oversee the Asset Protection Division's operational review. She said it without preamble. Ms. Vale, I need you to understand the position we're in. A federal witness is in this building. We have a confirmed breach attempt. And the only reason we caught it today is because you read a behavioral pattern in 20 minutes that our own review process missed in 9 days. A pause. I'd like to know how. I've been doing it for a long time, Hannah said. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have right now. Hannah pressed the back of her hand against her thigh. A habit, a small private reset. The behavioral log uses the Keller framework. I built most of it. I know what a stress peak at a consistent daily interval looks like, and I know it doesn't come from fatigue. It comes from pattern recognition. The dog found something and kept finding it. The interval matched your maintenance window. She looked at Mercer. The rest was just logic. Mercer was watching her with a quality of attention that was different from Ferris's, less analytical, more like someone recalibrating an assumption they'd made without realizing they'd made it. How many people currently working in federal K9 operations understand the Keller framework at the level you do? Ferris asked. Hannah was quiet for a moment. Fewer than when I left, she said. The program was restructured after I resigned. I don't know what survived. Not enough, Marcus said. It was the first thing he'd said in several minutes, and he said it in a way that meant he wasn't talking only about the program. Hannah looked at him. He met her eyes and didn't look away, which she gave him credit for. I need to get back to my floor, she said. Hannah? I've been gone a long time, she said, and I have patience. She walked out of the staging area with her back straight and her hands quiet at her sides, and she did not look back at Marcus Vale, standing in the corridor behind her. The floor was busy, which was useful. Busy meant she could move through it without stopping, without explaining, without the particular weight of other people's attention that the morning had loaded onto her. She checked charts. She managed a fluid rate adjustment in room 9. She spent 20 minutes with a post-surgical patient in room 22 who was frightened and needed someone to sit with him while the medication began working, not because it was strictly within her role, but because it was what was needed, and she was there. The patient's name was Harold. He was 71 years old. He had a son in another state who he'd talked to on the phone that morning, and a catheter that was making him miserable, and a fear that he was trying to manage by talking about his garden. I've got a Japanese maple, he told her. Been trying to get it through the winters for 6 years. Every year I think it's not going to make it. Every year it does. That sounds about right, Hannah said. You got a garden? No, I live in an apartment. You could do a balcony planter. I've thought about it. He was quiet for a moment. The medication was working. His shoulders had come down from around his ears. You're the one with the dogs, he said. She looked up from the chart. People were talking about it in the hall, he said. The federal dogs. Came right to you. He was watching her with the mild, unsurprised curiosity of someone old enough to have concluded that unusual things happen to specific people for reasons that were hard to articulate but real. What was that about? Old acquaintances, Hannah said. He smiled, closed his eyes. Lucky dogs, he said. She finished the notation, left the room, stood in the hallway for a moment with one hand on the wall and her eyes on the floor. Lucky dog. She had not cried in a professional setting in 4 years. She was not going to start now. She moved on. At 4:30 p.m., Mercer found her again. This was becoming a pattern she hadn't agreed to, but she was developing a reluctant recognition that it was probably going to continue whether she agreed to it or not. He appeared at the edge of the nurse's station with the particular quality of stillness that meant he was waiting without wanting to appear to be waiting, which took a specific kind of practiced patience. Ms. Vale. Agent Mercer. The situation with Boyle is in federal custody. The secure wing is locked down until we can complete a credential audit. He paused. That's not why I'm here. Hannah set down the chart. Why are you here? Atlas won't settle. She looked at him. He was not a man who asked for things easily. That much was clear even after 6 hours of intermittent contact. The way the request sat in the space between them was slightly uncomfortable, the way a shoe fits when it's almost the right size but not quite. He's not in distress, Mercer said. He's not showing any adverse behavioral signs. He's just not settling. He keeps orienting toward the East Corridor junction. His handler thinks he's still tracking something. Is he? We don't know. That's the problem. Hannah looked at the clock. Her shift ended at 5. She looked at the chart in her hand. She looked at the East Corridor junction, which she could see from where she was standing, and thought about a dog who had been trying to tell someone something for 9 days and had finally been heard and was now not sure if the job was finished. Give me 10 minutes to hand off, she said. The federal staging area had expanded since the afternoon. There were more personnel, more equipment, and the specific atmosphere of a security operation that had moved from prevention to investigation and hadn't yet fully processed the distance between the two. Atlas was in a secondary holding area off the main corridor, a partitioned space with water, a mat, and his handler, a young man named Trayvon, who had the bewildered, slightly embarrassed look of someone whose dog had been ignoring his commands all day. He's been like this for 2 hours, Trayvon said to Mercer, and then looked at Hannah with the expression of someone who wasn't sure what category to put her in. Hannah crouched down at the entry to the partition. Atlas looked at her immediately. Then he looked at the corridor. Then he looked back at her. I see you, she said quietly. What are you doing? He stood up, walked to the edge of the partition, looked at the corridor, looked back. He thinks it's not over, she said to Mercer. The threat was neutralized. The threat that we identified was neutralized. He's not convinced that was all of it. She watched the dog. Has Boyle said anything about working alone? Mercer was quiet for a second. He hasn't said anything at all. How long has the witness been in the secure wing? 11 days. And the maintenance window was 12 days old. Boyle started 1 day before the witness arrived. Hannah straightened up. He wasn't here for access. He was here for assessment. He was here mapping the wing, the shifts, the patrol patterns. She turned to look at Mercer directly. If Atlas is still flagging, it's because there's something in this building he's still reading, something Boyle didn't bring in with him, something he left, or someone else brought in independently. The shift in Mercer's expression was small and immediate, the particular compression of a person who has just upgraded a problem from solved to actively unresolved. He reached for his radio. I need a full sweep of the East Wing, secondary access points, maintenance panels, utility rooms. He looked at Hannah. Can he track? Not without a scent object. We have Boyle's outer gear in evidence. Then yes. What followed was not the clean, cinematic kind of operation that people imagined when they thought about federal security work. It was methodical and slow and involved a significant amount of standing around in corridors, while Atlas worked in careful overlapping passes, and Trevon managed the line, and Mercer relayed updates in the clipped, deliberately undramatic shorthand of someone who'd learned that excitement in a radio transmission was rarely useful. Hannah walked beside the team without being part of it, which was a distinction that felt accurate even if its edges were slightly unclear. She wasn't giving commands. She wasn't directing the search. She was reading the dog, the subtle shift in his body language, the quality of his attention at each location, the difference between the general alertness of a working animal and the specific sharpening focus of one that is getting closer to what it's looking for. She'd been doing this long enough that she didn't need to announce what she was seeing. She just needed to be present for the moment when the dog found it. That moment came at 5:47 p.m. in a utility room adjacent to the East Wing's secondary HVAC access. Atlas sat down. Not the frantic, insistent sit of an animal that had found something dangerous. Just the clean, definitive sit of a working dog that had completed its task and was communicating it clearly and without drama because it had been trained by people who understood that clarity was a form of trust. Mercer stepped forward. The room was unremarkable. Cleaning supplies, pipe access, a panel for the ventilation system's secondary control unit. He opened the panel. There were 3 small devices attached to the internal wiring, not explosives. Hannah could see that from the doorway. Smaller, neater. The kind of thing that someone who knew what they were doing put somewhere it wouldn't be found for days. Listening devices, the technical officer said, arriving from down the corridor. She looked at the panel for 3 seconds. And a signal tap on the HVAC control relay. If someone accessed the right frequency, they could monitor communication from the secure wing through the ventilation system. Mercer looked at Hannah. 9 days, Hannah said. The number sat there like something solid and heavy. He was trying to tell you for 9 days. I know. She looked at Atlas, who was still sitting beside the panel with the composed patience of an animal that had done what it was supposed to do and was waiting to be acknowledged for it. She crouched down and put her hand on the side of his face. Good dog, she said. He leaned into her hand just slightly, just for a second, and then pulled back into his professional posture. Still on task. Still present. Hannah straightened up. She realized her hands were shaking again. Not from fear, from something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. The combination of standing in a utility room in a federal hospital at the end of a shift that had started with a side entrance and a container of cold pasta, and holding in her head simultaneously the enormity of what had just been found, and the bizarre, mundane fact that she was still wearing her nursing badge and had a chart to sign off on before she left. Ms. Vale, Mercer's voice was careful. I need you to stay on site while we process this. I know. It's going to take a few hours. I know that too. He paused. Can I get you something? Coffee? She looked at him. He looked back. The professionalism was still there, but something around its edges had shifted in the way things shift when people have spent several hours in proximity to an actual emergency and have come out of it in one piece and don't quite know what to do with that yet. Yes, she said. Thank you. The next 2 hours happened in conference rooms and secure communications and a series of conversations that Hannah was partly included in and partly kept outside of, which she understood and didn't object to because her clearance was still inactive and the situation was still unfolding, and there were real reasons for the boundaries that had nothing to do with the other reasons. Marcus Vale was in the building. She was aware of him, the way you're aware of a thing you've decided not to look at directly. At 7:30 p.m., Ferris came to find her in the small waiting area outside the staging room. The devices are being processed. The technical team has confirmed they were placed over a 9-day period, incrementally, by someone with ongoing access. She sat down across from Hannah. Boyle had a contact inside. We're running the credential audit now. Inside the building? Inside the building. Ferris looked at her with the same processing, revealing nothing expression she'd worn all day. There are 11 people who had unescorted access to that utility room in the relevant window. We're going to be here for a while. Hannah absorbed this. 11. Including 3 medical staff. The words settled in the room between them. You're telling me this, Hannah said, because you want me to understand that the situation is more complicated than a single detained contractor. I'm telling you this, Ferris said, because you've been part of this situation since 8:40 this morning and you deserve to understand what you're part of. Hannah looked at the wall. The fluorescents in this room had the same frequency as the ones on the trauma floor, the same slight buzz that you stopped hearing or told yourself you had. Who else had access? She asked. The 3 medical staff. I can't share names yet. That's not what I asked. Ferris looked at her steadily. 1 physician, 2 support staff. A pause. Not nursing. Hannah breathed out, slow. She hadn't realized she'd been waiting for that. Okay, she said. Ferris studied her for a moment with that data processing expression. You've been handling this very calmly, she said. I'm not calm, Hannah said. I'm just quiet. The distinction seemed to register. Ferris nodded slightly. Your previous supervisor speaks very highly of you, she said. Director Vale. He submitted a file on the Keller program to our division 3 months ago, recommending a formal review of the program's legacy contributions. Specifically, the behavioral framework you developed. Hannah went very still. He submitted it 3 months ago, she said. Yes. That's... She stopped. 3 months ago. Before today. Before the breach. Before Atlas walked through the east corridor and found her in an anteroom with her hand against the door frame. That's before any of this happened. Yes, Ferris said. It has nothing to do with today, procedurally. But I thought you should know. She stood up. We'll need you available for the next couple of hours. After that, you're free to go. She left. Hannah sat with the information in the way you sit with something that rearranges a small part of the structure you'd built around an old decision. Marcus had submitted the file 3 months ago, which meant 3 months ago he had been trying to do something, which meant the story she'd been telling herself, the clean story about a man who had ignored her and let it cost her and had never looked back, was missing at least 1 chapter. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She was still sitting with it at 8:15 when Mercer came back with 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag that turned out to contain a sandwich from the cafeteria vending rotation, which was not good coffee and definitely not a good sandwich, and which she accepted without comment because she hadn't eaten anything since the cold pasta at 1:15 p.m. The witness is secure, Mercer said. The wing is clean. We're doing a full communications audit before morning. Good. He sat down across from her. He had the look of someone who had been operating at high intensity for several hours and was now processing the downshift with the slightly uncertain quality of a person who is better at the crisis than the aftermath. She recognized it because she had it too. Can I ask you something? He said. You can try. Why did you leave? She looked at him. I told you why. You told me the official version, he said. It wasn't accusatory, just accurate. The one that explains what happened without explaining what it cost. Hannah was quiet for a moment. She picked up the coffee. It was bad coffee, but it was hot, and she was grateful for it in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. I had a dog, she said. Gideon. He came to Keller after a mission in which his handler had been killed. He wasn't injured physically, but he was broken in every other way. It took me 14 months to get him stable. 14 months of daily sessions, consistent approach, methodical trust building. I documented everything. When he was assessed for return to service, I submitted a report recommending against it. Not permanently, just not yet. He needed another 6 to 8 weeks. She set the cup down. The assessment board overruled me. They needed the unit. I was deployed 3 weeks after I submitted my report. Mercer was quiet. He was KIA 2 weeks into the deployment. Handler survived. The dog didn't. She said it plainly because it was 4 years old, and she'd learned to say it plainly. The plainness didn't mean what people sometimes assumed it meant. I resigned the next morning. I'm sorry, Mercer said. So am I. Outside the small room, the federal staging area hummed with the sustained activity of an operation that had shifted into its documentation phase. Hannah could hear voices, equipment, the specific ambient sound of people doing the slow, careful work that came after the fast, dangerous work. The Keller protocols, Mercer said. Are they still being used correctly? Some of them. She thought about the behavioral log she'd read that morning. The framework is there, but the application has drifted. The people using it are applying the mechanics without always understanding the reasoning. Could that be fixed? She looked at him. I'm asking a genuine question, he said. not a leading one. It could be taught, she said carefully, if there were someone available to teach it. Right, he said. The conversation sat there with a shape that both of them could see clearly and that neither of them addressed directly, because it was late and the day had been long and some things could wait until morning. At 9:03 p.m., Mercer's radio crackled. Mercer. The voice on the other end was clipped and taut. Credential audit pulled a flag. One of the 11 is currently in the building. Hannah's head came up. Location? Mercer said. East Wing. They badged into the secondary staff access 6 minutes ago. A pause that had weight in it. It's one of the medical staff, a physician. Mercer was already standing. The name, he said. Dr. Elliot Ashby, the voice said. He's the director's son. The silence that followed was exactly 4 seconds long. Hannah counted them without meaning to. Mercer looked at her. She looked back at him. Director Ashby doesn't know, she said. It wasn't a question. He's upstairs in his office, Mercer said. He's been in his office since 7. He was already moving toward the door. Then he stopped, turned back. Stay here. I know, she said. He was gone. Hannah sat with the paper cup of bad coffee and the silence that had replaced the sound of his footsteps, and somewhere in the east wing of Riverside Federal Medical Center, a man whose name was on the door of this building's highest office was about to learn something about his own son that would not be possible to unknow. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the cup. The fluorescence buzzed. And somewhere down the corridor she heard Atlas bark. Once, sharp, absolute, and then go silent. The bark echoed, and then the corridor went quiet in the particular way that quiet happens after something sharp. Not absence of sound, but the active holding of breath that a building full of trained people produces when they're all listening for the same thing. Hannah was on her feet before she registered standing up. She wasn't supposed to move. Mercer had said stay here with the tone of a man who meant it and had reasons for meaning it. She understood the reasons. She was a civilian with inactive clearance in an active federal security situation, and the professionally correct thing was to remain in the small waiting area with her bad coffee and let the people with weapons and jurisdiction handle what was happening in the East Wing. She stayed in the doorway instead. From where she was standing, she could see the length of the main staging corridor, the checkpoint, the 2 agents at the junction, the secondary access door at the far end that had a red indicator light above it that was currently illuminated where it had been dark all evening. Trevin came past at a near run with Atlas on a short lead. Atlas looked at Hannah as he passed, not the long checking look from the anteroom. A faster look, focused, purposeful, the kind that said, I know you're there and I don't have time. She pressed her shoulder against the doorframe. From somewhere in the east wing, beyond the secondary access door, she could hear voices, not words, just the compressed, taut sound of people managing a situation that had not yet resolved. Then a sound she hadn't expected, a single crash. Heavy. Medical equipment from the weight of it, the specific resonance of a cart or a stand going over, metal against tile. And then a voice she recognized, not from content, but from register, Director Ashby, not the measured corner office version, something rawer and worse. 2 minutes later, Mercer came back through the secondary access door. He was not running. Federal agents, Hannah had noticed, almost never ran unless they had to, because running in a contained environment communicated a level of loss of control that was operationally counterproductive. But he was moving at the absolute upper threshold of not running, and the expression on his face had compressed into something that was hard to read and harder to look at. Dr. Elliot Ashby is in federal custody, he said. He said it to the room in general and to Hannah specifically. I was found in the utility corridor adjacent to the secondary HVAC access with a cellular relay device and an encrypted communication unit. He was there to retrieve them, Hannah said. He knew we'd found the listening devices. Yes. He was tipped off. Mercer's jaw moved. That's what we're determining. Who had access to the credential audit results before the flag was called in? 3 people in the coordination office. So either there's a third element to this, or someone in your coordination office made a call they shouldn't have. Miss Vale. His voice was even. I'm aware. She stepped back from the doorway. Not because he told her to, but because she could see that the situation had moved into a phase that she was genuinely not equipped to help with, and the most useful thing she could do was remove one variable from his immediate field. Director Ashby, she said, Senior, does he know? Mercer's expression did something she couldn't categorize. He knows his son is in custody. He doesn't know the full scope yet. A pause. It's a difficult situation. That was the understatement of a day that had been full of understatements. I imagine it is, Hannah said. They put her in a different room after that, slightly larger, with a window that looked onto the east parking structure and a chair that was less uncomfortable than the previous one. A junior agent brought more coffee without being asked, which she interpreted as a sign that Mercer had said something to someone. She sat with the window and the parking structure and the accumulated weight of the day, which was considerable. At 9:41 p.m., Marcus Vale came in. He closed the door behind him, which told her the conversation was going to be one he didn't want overheard. He sat down across from her without the hesitation of earlier. He'd moved past the rehearsal versus reality gap and arrived somewhere that was just the two of them in a room with the unfinished thing between them. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm fine." "Hannah." "I'm tired," she said. "And I'm fine. Both are true." He looked at her in that particular way he'd always had, the one that made you feel like you were being read carefully and that what was being read mattered. It had felt like respect once. She wasn't sure what it felt like now. "Ferris told you about the file," he said. "Yes." "I want to explain why You don't have to." "I'd like to." She looked at the window. The parking structure was mostly empty at this hour, a handful of cars and pools of fluorescent light. 3 months ago, she said. "Why 3 months ago?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because 3 months ago I found out that the Keller framework was being applied incorrectly in 6 of the 8 units currently using it, and that the behavioral data we were getting back from handlers was being misread consistently. And I realized that the problem wasn't the framework. It was that I'd let the people who built the framework walk away and assumed the documentation would be enough." He stopped. "It wasn't enough." "No," Hannah said. "It wasn't. I handled Gideon badly. I handled your report badly. I knew it at the time, and I made the wrong call anyway because I was managing 17 competing priorities, and I convinced myself the risk was acceptable." His voice was flat and factual, the same tone she'd used when she talked about Gideon earlier. She understood why. The flatness wasn't absence of feeling. It was what feeling looked like when you'd been living with it long enough that it had become structural. "The dog died because I made the wrong call. You left because I made the wrong call. Those are facts." "Yes," she said. "They are. I'm not asking you to forgive it." "Good," she said. "Because I haven't." He nodded. A small nod, like he'd expected that and thought it was fair. "The file I submitted recommends that the Keller framework be formally reinstated as the federal standard and that the position of lead behavioral consultant be recreated, with appropriate compensation and clearance." He looked at his hands. "I put your name on it." The room was quiet. "You didn't ask me," Hannah said. "No, I should have. I thought if I asked first, you'd say no." "I probably would have." "I know." A pause. "Would you still?" She turned that over. She sat with it the way she'd sat with the information about the file earlier, but not trying to force a conclusion, just letting it be present until something clarified. "I don't know," she said. It was the most honest answer she had. He stood up. "That's different from no," he said. "I'll take it." He left. Hannah looked at the parking structure for a long moment, and then she put the question away in the part of her mind that was good at waiting, and she tried to think about what she knew about the current situation instead. At 10:15 p.m., the night took a turn that nobody in the building had planned for. It started with a medical alert from the secure wing. Not a security alert, a medical one. The attending physician for the protected witness, a Dr. Mara Osei, came through the east access door with the specific gait of someone who needed help and was already calculating the fastest route to it. She found Mercer first. "The witness is in distress," she said. "Cardiac presentation. I need a full trauma team, and I need them now." Mercer's radio was already in his hand. Hannah was in the corridor by then. She'd heard the door, heard the tone of Dr. Osei's voice, and she stepped forward without quite deciding to. "What's his presentation?" Hannah asked. Dr. Osei looked at her with a brief flash of "Who are you?" that gave way to "There's no time." Chest pain onset 20 minutes ago, diaphoresis, pressure in the left arm. Heart rate is elevated, blood pressure dropped in the last 5 minutes. He's conscious, but is bad. Age? 62. Hypertensive, managed. No prior cardiac history in his file, but his file is... She made a gesture that communicated that the file was federal and incomplete in the way federal files sometimes were. Incomplete. Has anyone notified the cardiac team? I called it in from inside, but the switchboard routing in the secure wing... She stopped. Her expression said the rest. The communication tap. The devices in the HVAC panel. Even removed and in evidence, the investigation of the system had apparently created enough disruption to the wing's internal communication relay that the standard medical alert routing was compromised. The trauma team hasn't been called, Hannah said. Not through normal channels. Hannah turned to Mercer. I need direct access to the trauma team on call. Now. Your trauma support, not... I know what I am, she said. I also know that right now I am the fastest way to get the right people to that room because I know every person on the night trauma rotation and I know which of them can be there in 4 minutes. Do you want to have a conversation about my job description or do you want the witness to get a crash cart? It was the longest sentence she'd said at one time all day. It came out without a stutter, which she noticed distantly and set aside. Mercer handed her his radio. She made 2 calls. She was precise and fast and used the clipped, specific language of someone who had worked emergency hospital floors long enough that the language had become automatic. The trauma team came in 6 minutes. Not 4. She'd been optimistic about Dr. Pauline Garrett's response time, but 6, which was still fast, and they came in fully equipped, and Dr. Garrett took one look at the witness and said, "Get me a 12 lead," in the tone that meant she'd already made her first assessment and was confirming it. Hannah stood outside the room. She was not part of the cardiac team. Her role was, genuinely and correctly, not inside that room. She stood in the corridor and listened to the organized intensity of people doing their jobs well, and she counted the seconds the way she always did when someone was in a room and she was not, and the outcome was uncertain. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, Dr. Garrett said, "He's stable," through the door, and Hannah's shoulders came down approximately 2 inches from where they'd been. Mercer appeared beside her. "He's going to be okay," she said. "Thanks to you. Thanks to Dr. Osei for getting out of that wing fast and Dr. Garrett for running instead of walking." She paused. "I just made 2 phone calls. You made them in about 90 seconds and you knew exactly who to call." "I know my colleagues," she said. "That's not exceptional. That's just paying attention." He was quiet. Then, "You do that a lot. Attribute things to other factors." "I attribute things accurately." "Do you?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that recalibrating expression again, the one that had been appearing and reappearing throughout the day, each time with slightly more of whatever was behind it visible. "Ms. Vale," he said. "Hannah, you have been the most useful person in this building today. Not the most credentialed, not the most armed, not the most authorized, the most useful. And I'm watching you stand in a corridor attributing it to phone calls and dog behavior and logic, and I want to..." He stopped, collected something. "I want to make sure you understand what actually happened today." She looked at the closed door of the room where the witness was being monitored. "I understand," she said. "I just don't need you to say it." "Why not?" She thought about it honestly. "Because I've been in this building for 3 years," she said, "and the people who couldn't hear me didn't change because someone told them what I was worth. And the people who can hear me..." She stopped. "They already know." Mercer was quiet for a long time. "The dogs," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "The dogs already know." At 11:20 p.m., the investigation produced its third and worst finding of the night. Hannah was sitting with Dr. Osei in the small family consultation room outside the secure wing. They'd been talking through the witness's medication history in the way that medical people talk through a shared emergency after the fact, systematically, almost therapeutically, when Mercer knocked and opened the door with the expression that had become the signature expression of the evening, something complicated that he was carrying carefully. "I need to tell you something," he said, and then he looked at Dr. Osei with an uncertainty that was actually, Hannah realized, a question. She stays, Hannah said. She said it calmly, without checking whether that was her decision to make. She's been managing this witness's care under compromised conditions for 11 days. She's earned it. Mercer made a choice. The communication tap wasn't the only compromise in the wing, he said. The technical team found a secondary element in the medication dispensary records. Someone accessed the witness's medication file and made a modification 8 days ago. Dr. Osei went absolutely still. His hypertension medication, she said. It came out barely above a breath. The dosing record was altered. The modification was small enough that it wouldn't trigger an automatic alert, but over 8 days, it would suppress his natural cardiac regulation. Dr. Osei's voice had gone to a place that was past anger and past fear and into the very quiet territory beyond both. The cardiac event tonight wasn't incidental. No, Mercer said. It was the intended outcome. Hannah felt the specific cold of that. The particular kind of cold that comes from understanding that something you thought was a medical emergency was, in fact, the point. That someone had been slowly, methodically adjusting a man's medication in increments too small to detect, waiting for his heart to do what a compromised heart eventually does. Who had access to that dispensary file? Dr. Osei asked. 4 people. 3 nurses from the secure wing rotation, he paused, and Dr. Elliot Ashby. The room processed this. He didn't just place listening devices, Hannah said. No. He was trying to prevent the testimony entirely. That's the working conclusion. Dr. Osei put her hands flat on the table in front of her. It was a specific gesture, the kind of thing someone does when they need their hands somewhere they can see them, somewhere they can verify are still under control. My patient, she said. He was under my care. I reviewed his medications every morning. I followed the dispensary record. She stopped. I followed an altered record. You couldn't have known, Mercer said. I should have. Dr. Osei. Hannah's voice was quiet, but it was there, solid enough to interrupt. You should have been able to trust the system you were working in. You did everything correctly given the information available to you. What happened to that record is not a failure of your medicine. It's a failure of the people who were supposed to protect the infrastructure you were depending on. Dr. Osei looked at her. Something moved through her expression. Not relief, not exactly, but something that took some of the weight off the flat hand's posture. The witness needs to be fully reevaluated, Hannah said to Mercer. Every medication, current dosing, the interaction profile for what he's actually been receiving versus what was documented tonight. I've already requested an independent pharmacology review. Good. And the dispensary system needs to be locked out pending a complete audit. No medication access through that system for anyone until it's been verified clean. Also in progress. And the 3 secure wing nurses need to be interviewed separately and immediately, not because they're suspects, but because they may have observed something over the past 8 days that they don't realize is relevant. Mercer was writing something. He looked up. Do you want to conduct those interviews? She opened her mouth, closed it. I'm a nurse, she said. Not an investigator. You're also the person who, twice today, identified things that trained investigators missed. He was not saying it to flatter her. He was saying it the way he said most things, as a direct operational assessment. The nurses might talk to you differently than they'd talk to me. Hannah sat with this. Let me think about it, she said. It was 11:34 p.m. She had now been in this building for 17 hours and 19 minutes. She had come in through the side entrance. She had a container of cold pasta in the staff refrigerator that she was probably not going to eat. She had a Japanese maple in Harold's room, and 12 dogs who remembered her, and a man who had put her name on a file 3 months before anyone asked him to, and a director whose son was in federal custody, and a witness whose heart had been quietly managed toward failure by someone who had access to a system that should have been protected. And she had, somewhere underneath all of it, the particular exhausted clarity that comes when a day strips away enough of the ordinary that you can see, briefly and with uncomfortable precision, what you're actually made of. She looked at Mercer. She looked at Dr. Osei. All right, she said. Tell me about the 3 nurses. The interview process took 90 minutes. She sat with each of them separately in the consultation room, and she asked about their routines and their shifts and the small, specific observations that people accumulate in an enclosed environment without realizing they're accumulating them. She didn't lead, she didn't pressure, she asked and she listened, which was something she had been doing her entire professional life, asking and listening and waiting for the part that mattered to surface. It surfaced in the second interview with a nurse named Rosa, who had been on the secure wing for 6 of the 11 days, and who, when Hannah asked about anything unusual in the routine, said, "There was the delivery." What delivery? 8 days ago, Dr. Ashby came through with a pharmacy courier. Personally, I thought it was unusual because physicians don't usually escort couriers, but he had the proper authorization, and Rosa stopped. I didn't question it. Of course you didn't, Hannah said. He was the physician on record. It was his authorization to present. I should have. You followed protocol, Hannah said. Someone else broke it. She brought Mercer the information at 1:10 a.m. He received it, processed it, and made 3 radio calls. She sat across the table from him and watched the tired but functional quality of a man who had been operating in crisis mode for hours and had not yet reached the point where it was going to catch up with him. The courier service is being pulled, he said. If Ashby used a specific individual, we'll have them by morning. There's more to this, Hannah said. He looked at her. The organization targeting this witness had enough reach to place an operative in your maintenance rotation, access your medication dispensary records, and compromise your wing's communication relay, she said. Boyle was the access point, but Boyle didn't design this. Someone designed this. And Elliot Ashby didn't find this network on his own, which means someone recruited him, Mercer said. How long has he been working here? 14 months. Then the recruitment predates the witness placement by at least 3 months. This wasn't opportunistic. She said it slowly, following the logic the way she followed a behavioral pattern. Not trying to reach a conclusion, just following the thread. They knew this witness was coming. They had an asset in place before the witness arrived. Mercer was very still. That's an intelligence failure, he said. The words had weight to them. Yes, Hannah said, a significant one. She watched him absorb that. It was the largest implication of the evening, larger than Boyle, larger than the devices, larger than Elliot Ashby's arrest. If the organization had known the witness was coming, if they'd placed their asset months in advance, then the breach was not a response to a situation. It was a plan. I need to make some calls, Mercer said. I know. He stood up. He looked at her across the table with the direct, calibrated quality that she'd been observing all day. Go home, he said. Get some sleep. I need you back here in the morning, and I need you functional. She noted the I need you back here without commenting on it, but she felt it settle in the way things settle when they've been said plainly and mean what they say. I'll be here, she said. She stood up. She collected her badge and her jacket. She was almost at the door when Mercer said her name. She turned. The Keller file, he said. Director Vale's recommendation. I read it before we deployed. I read it because the behavioral irregularities in Atlas had been flagging for days, and I was looking for anything that might help. He paused. Your name was on it, and I read your record, and I thought whoever this woman is, she's exactly who we'd need if something went wrong with these animals. Hannah stood in the doorway. And then you walked into that anteroom, he said. She held that for a moment. Then she said, Good night, Agent Mercer. She walked out into the east corridor, past the staging area, past the checkpoint, and out through the main hospital exit. Not the side entrance, not the 4-minute detour, just the front door. It was 1:28 a.m. The parking structure was cold and mostly empty, and the fluorescents were the same frequency as inside, the same slight buzz that she'd been telling herself for 3 years she'd stopped hearing. She stood beside her car for a moment. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, which was unusual enough at this hour that she looked at it before getting in. It read, You should know that Director Vale's file isn't the only one. There is a second review, one that recommends something different. Check your federal employee record in the morning. It was unsigned. Hannah stood in the cold parking structure with her phone in her hand and the fluorescents buzzing and the night air moving against her face, and she read the message twice. Her federal employee record, the one she hadn't accessed in 4 years, the one that contained not just her Keller file, but her full clearance history, her evaluations, her departure documentation. Someone had put something in that record, and someone wanted her to find it before the morning. She sat in the car for 3 minutes before starting the engine. The text was still on her phone, screen lit in the dark of the parking structure, And she read it a third time the way you read something when you're trying to determine whether the words mean what you think they mean, or whether you're tired enough that you're filling in implications that aren't there. The words meant what she thought they meant. Someone had accessed her federal employee record. Not just read it, modified it, or added to it, or placed something in it that wasn't there before. And whoever had done it had sent her an anonymous text at 1:28 in the morning to make sure she checked before the morning briefing, which meant the timing mattered, which meant whatever was in that record was going to be relevant to something that happened in the morning. She forwarded the text to Mercer without a message. Then she started the engine and drove home. Her apartment was 12 minutes from the hospital on empty roads at this hour. She'd timed it once, early in her tenure at Riverside, in the way you time things when you're trying to understand the geography of a new life. It had seemed relevant at the time to know exactly how far she was from the place she spent most of her hours. It had seemed like useful information. She made tea she didn't drink and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her federal employee login, which she hadn't used in 4 years, and was obscurely surprised still worked. The record loaded. She went to the documentation section first. Evaluations, commendations, incident reports. Her Keller file was there, the one she'd seen before she left. The standard exit documentation with her resignation letter attached, and the board's acknowledgement of it. Standard. Correct. The official version of what had happened. Below it, there was a new entry. Time-stamped 3 days ago. She clicked it. It was a formal review document. Not Marcus Vale's recommendation. She'd been told about that one. This was different. A disciplinary review authored by a name she didn't recognize in the Office of Federal Personnel Compliance, dated retroactively to the period of her departure from Keller. It documented, in careful bureaucratic language, a series of professional conduct violations: insubordination, unauthorized disclosure of classified operational information, interference with a federal deployment decision. It was a record of misconduct. It was also, in every specific detail, false. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her kitchen chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and the particular cold she'd felt in the conference room when she'd understood what had been done to the witness's medication, that slow, methodical management toward a bad outcome, settled over her again like weather. This had been placed 3 days ago, before the breach, before Boyle was detained, before anyone could have known that she would be in this building, that her name would come up, that Director Vale's recommendation would become relevant. Someone had been preparing for her to be a problem before she was a problem, which meant someone had known 3 days ago that she was going to be brought back in. She picked up her phone and called Mercer. It was 2:07 a.m. He answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't slept. "I accessed the record," she said. "I know, I got your text and I had someone pull it 15 minutes ago." His voice was level, but the level had a tension underneath it that hadn't been there earlier. "There's a misconduct filing. It's fabricated. I know that." 3 days ago, she said. "Someone put it there 3 days ago." "Yes." "Which means someone in or connected to this operation knew your name was in Vale's file before the deployment here. Before today." A pause. "Which means they were running a parallel operation, breach the witness, discredit the person most likely to flag the breach." The logic of it was clean and cold and made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with being afraid and everything to do with understanding the shape of what had been built around her. "I need to know who authored that review," she said. "Working on it." "Tonight?" "I have people working on it right now." She exhaled. "Okay." "Go to sleep," he said. "I mean it. You're not going to be useful to me at 7 a.m. if you've been awake since 5 yesterday. "I'm aware." "Hannah." The use of her first name again without the professional buffer of Ms. Vale. "The record is already flagged for formal challenge. Whatever's in it doesn't stick. But I need you in this building with your head clear when the morning briefing happens, because that briefing is going to include people who are going to be very interested in what you know." "What kind of people?" "The kind with more authority than me," he said. "Get some sleep." She closed the laptop. She did not sleep for a long time. She was back at Riverside at 6:45 a.m. Not the side entrance, the front door, the same way she'd left. It was a small thing, and she was aware of the smallness of it, and did it anyway. The hospital had a different quality in the early morning after a security event, the same surface activity, the same shift change, the same rattling gurneys and recycled air, but underneath it a kind of collective heightened awareness, the specific alertness of a building, full of people who knew something significant had happened and were waiting to understand what it meant for them. Brianna Marsh was at the nurses' station when Hannah arrived, which was unusual. Brianna's shift didn't start until 7. She was there early, which meant she'd heard enough to want to be there early, and when she saw Hannah, she straightened in a way that wasn't quite self-conscious but was adjacent to it. "You're here," Brianna said. "I work here," Hannah said. "I know, Brianna stopped. She looked at Hannah with something that was clearly costing her something. "I heard what happened, some of it, the lockdown, the arrest. People are talking." She paused. "Someone said you were involved in figuring it out." "Some of it." "Hannah." Brianna's voice dropped to the register she used when she was being careful. I know I haven't always been, the way I've talked to you, She stopped again. "I'm sorry. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry." Hannah looked at her. The apology was real. She could see that. It was also incomplete in the way that apologies are when someone is sorry for the shape of a thing without yet fully understanding what the thing was made of. But it was a start. "I know," Hannah said. "I should have—" "Brianna," Hannah kept her voice even. "We can talk about it properly later. Right now I need to know what the floor situation is, and I need to check on Harold in room 22. Brianna blinked. Then she straightened the rest of the way back into charge nurse posture and started the handoff. Some things changed slowly. Hannah understood that, and she'd learned, over years and in ways that had cost her, to work with the speed of real change rather than the speed she wanted it to move. Harold was awake when she checked in. He had his son on video call, the phone propped against the water pitcher, and he waved at Hannah when she appeared in the doorway in the way elderly patients wave at nurses they've decided to claim. Territorial, pleased, slightly proprietorial. "She's the one with the dogs," he told his son loudly. "You don't need to," Hannah started. "I told him about the dogs," Harold said. "He didn't believe me." "Hi," said the son on the screen, a man in his 40s with his father's eyes. He really wouldn't stop talking about it. "How are you feeling?" Hannah asked Harold, redirecting. "Like I had surgery 2 days ago," he said, which is accurate. He studied her. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I slept a little." "A little," he repeated, the way people repeat things when they consider the amount inadequate. "The maple's still going to be there when this is over, you know." She wasn't entirely sure what he meant and was fairly sure it wasn't about his tree. "I know," she said. "Rest." What? The morning briefing was not in any room Hannah had been in before. It was on the 4th floor, in a conference suite that was larger and more formally equipped than anything in the hospital's regular rotation. The kind of room that existed for precisely this category of situation and spent most of its life unoccupied. By 8 a.m., it held 14 people. Deputy Director Ferris was there. Mercer was there. Marcus Vale was there, looking like a man who had slept 3 hours and was running on the particular fuel that serious people run on when sleep isn't available. Dr. Osei was there, along with the hospital's legal counsel and a woman from the Office of Federal Personnel Compliance, whose presence Hannah clocked immediately because it was that office's name on the fabricated review in her record. There were also 2 people she didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, both with the specific quality of stillness that meant federal seniority, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it was too senior for announcement to be useful. She found out their names in the first 5 minutes. Assistant Director Warren Pell and Senior Investigator Dara Okonkwo, Joint Oversight Division. The Joint Oversight Division, Hannah knew from her Keller years, was the entity that got involved when a federal operation had failed badly enough that multiple agencies needed to be in the same room talking about it. Pell opened the briefing without ceremony. "As of 6 a.m. this morning, we have 3 individuals in federal custody connected to the attempted compromise of a protected witness at this facility." He laid it out in the way of someone who had been laying out operational summaries for decades. Clean, sequenced, no wasted words. Terrence Boyle, who provided external access and placed listening devices. Dr. Elliot Ashby, who provided internal access, modified the witness's medication record, and served as the primary internal operative. And as of 3:47 this morning, one Marcus Rue, a contracted pharmaceutical courier who transported the modified medication dosing records into the facility under Dr. Ashby's authorization 8 days ago. The room absorbed this. The medication modification would have been fatal, Dr. Osei said. It was not a question. The forensic pharmacology review confirms that without last night's cardiac intervention, the witness had an estimated 72-hour window before the dosing imbalance produced a non-survivable event, Pell said. It was the language of reports, but underneath it was something that the people in the room who had been in that wing last night could feel at a different frequency. The intervention and the prior identification of the threat prevented that outcome. He looked at Hannah. Everyone looked at Hannah. She looked back at Pell steadily and said nothing, because it wasn't the moment for her to speak, and she'd learned at some cost to understand the difference between the moments when her voice was the most useful thing she had and the moments when her silence was. I want to address the secondary element, Ferris said. She opened a folder. At 2:09 a.m. this morning, a fabricated misconduct filing was identified in the federal employee record of Hannah Vale, RN, formerly of the Keller Recovery and Rehabilitation Facility. The filing was authored 3 days ago under the credentials of a compliance officer named Delbert Foss. The woman from the Office of Federal Personnel Compliance, a compact, watchful person named Audrey Neal, shifted in her chair. Delbert Foss resigned from this office 11 months ago, Neal said. His credentials should have been deactivated at departure. The fact that they were not is a failure in our decommissioning protocol, and we are conducting a full internal review. The filing itself, Ferris said, its contents, are without factual basis, Neal said. The review conducted this morning found no documentation, no witness accounts, no contemporaneous records of any kind that support the violations alleged. The filing is being formally expunged from Ms. Vale's record as of this morning. Hannah heard this. She heard it the way you hear something that you've been waiting for longer than you realized, not with the sharp relief of surprise, but with the slower, heavier release of something that has been held a long time being set down. Who placed it? Mercer asked. The IP access trail goes through a proxy that we're still untangling, Ferris said. But the working assumption is that it connects to the same network that recruited Elliot Ashby, someone with access to federal personnel systems who knew Vale's name was in the Keller file and moved to preemptively discredit her. Before she could discredit the operation, Pell said. He looked at Hannah again. They knew you were coming back in. They knew before I did, Hannah said. I didn't know I was coming back in until yesterday morning. No, Mercer said, but Director Vale's file had been submitted 3 months ago. It was working its way through review channels. Someone in those channels passed the information. Another thread in the same network. Another room of the same building, mapped in advance. The public part of the collapse started at 10 a.m. Elliot Ashby had been held overnight in federal custody in a secure location off-site. At 9:15 a.m., his attorney arrived and advised him to cooperate. At 9:43 a.m., he began to talk. Hannah was not in the room for any of this. She learned it in pieces, the way you learn things when you're adjacent to a federal investigation rather than inside it, through Mercer, through Ferris, through the quality of the activity in the fourth-floor corridor that she could see from the conference room where she'd been asked to remain available. What Elliot Ashby said, once he started talking, took 40 minutes to say and produced 17 pages of typed notes and a series of phone calls that went up a chain that Hannah could track by the expressions of the people coming in and out of the corridor. At 10:22 a.m., Director Lowell Ashby arrived on the 4th floor. Hannah saw him in the corridor through the conference room's interior window. He had the look of a man who had been told something during the night that he'd spent the hours since trying to find a framework for, and had arrived at the morning without finding one. He was composed, the professional composure that had served him in every difficult situation his career had produced. But it was the composure of something that was being held very tightly, rather than something that came naturally. He was met at the corridor by Pell and a woman Hannah didn't recognize from the hospital's legal team. She couldn't hear the conversation. She watched it anyway. The specific body language of a man receiving formal information in a professional setting, while the personal weight of that information pressed against the professional exterior, and the particular moment when the professional exterior stopped being adequate. That moment came at 10:31 a.m. She saw it from across a corridor through glass. Lowell Ashby put one hand against the wall, just briefly, just for a second. And then he straightened and continued the conversation, because he was the director and the building was still running and there was nothing else to do. Hannah looked away. Whatever she felt about Lowell Ashby and his corner office and the 3 years of morning walks through the side entrance, it wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated than that, and she wasn't going to examine it in a conference room with 14 federal personnel outside the door. At 11:05 a.m., Mercer came in. Ashby's statement implicates a network of 4 additional individuals with access to federal facility operations in 2 other jurisdictions, he said. He sat down across from her without the intermediary of small talk or setup. The network has been operating for at least 18 months. The witness you helped protect is one of 3 targets they were working to eliminate before a series of interconnected trials that begin in 6 weeks. Hannah absorbed this. 3 facilities. 3. This one and 2 others. The other 2 were accessed through different methods, administrative rather than operational. No K9 units, no behavioral framework. He paused. No one like you. Don't, she said. I'm not flattering you. I'm giving you the operational picture. I know the difference. She looked at the table. The other 2 witnesses, are they safe? Protocols have been updated in the last 6 hours. They're being moved. He looked at her steadily. Because of the information from this facility, because of what was found here. She pressed the back of her hand against the edge of the table. The misconduct filing, she said. The person who placed it. Do you know who yet? Preliminary trace points to someone inside the Keller restructuring office. Someone who had access to federal personnel systems after the program was reorganized. He paused. We'll have a name by this afternoon. Was it connected to the people who overruled my report on Gideon? The question came out quieter than she intended. It had been sitting in the back of her mind since the early hours. The thread she hadn't quite pulled because she wasn't sure she was ready for what it was attached to. Mercer was quiet for a moment. We don't know yet. The restructuring happened 18 months after you left. But the Keller program's restructuring created the personnel access that was later used to place the false filing. Yes. So whatever went wrong inside that program, it didn't end when I left. No, Mercer said. It didn't. She sat with that. It was not the satisfying kind of revelation, the kind where a thing you've been angry about turns out to have been someone else's deliberate wrongdoing, which transforms your anger into something righteous and clean. It was the messier kind where a thing you've been angry about turns out to be part of something larger and more complicated, and the anger doesn't resolve, it just finds its proper context. Gideon was still gone. That didn't change, but the shape of why was different than she'd understood it, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with that. There's something else, Mercer said. She looked up. Elliot Ashby, in his statement, specifically referenced your name. He said it carefully, watching her face. He said the network had identified you as a risk 3 months ago when Vale's file entered review channels. The instruction was to preemptively discredit you before you could be brought back into federal proximity. He paused. The specific language he used was that you were, and I'm quoting, the one person who would actually understand what the dogs were doing. The silence in the room had weight to it. He knew about the K9 units, Hannah said. He had access to the deployment schedule. He knew the behavioral irregularities had been logged and internally reviewed and attributed to fatigue. He was counting on that assessment holding. He was counting on no one reading Atlas correctly. Yes. Hannah thought about 9 days. 9 days of a dog trying to tell someone something and the system around him not understanding the language. And one morning, in an anteroom with her hand against a doorframe, and the particular knowledge of someone who had spent 5 years learning to listen to things that didn't use words. They planned around a gap, she said, the gap that existed because the people who could read the behavioral signals correctly weren't in the program anymore. Yes. And the gap existed because the program was restructured in a way that lost those people. Yes. And the restructuring was influenced by the same network. We don't have that confirmed yet, Mercer said, but it's being investigated. Hannah was quiet for a long moment. The shape of it was almost architectural. Not a single betrayal, not a single bad decision, but a structure. Something built over time to create specific weaknesses in specific places, and then to exploit those weaknesses at a moment of maximum operational consequence. She'd walked out of Keller 4 years ago believing she'd made a decision about her own life. She was beginning to understand that someone else had been making decisions about her life's architecture without her consent and for much longer than 4 years. "I need some air," she said. She went to the roof. Not the east side, where the federal personnel were still running equipment. The west stairwell, up 4 flights to the access door that opened onto the HVAC maintenance level, technically restricted, but her badge still worked on the standard hospital locks, and this was not a moment for following rules she'd never broken for reasons that had never mattered until today. The air was cold and smelled of city and metal and the particular quality of a morning that had aged past its early hours into something more complicated. She stood at the parapet and looked at the parking structure and the roofline of the building across the street and the sliver of sky between them that was the gray blue of a morning that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to be. She stood there for 11 minutes. She counted them without meaning to. She thought about Gideon. She thought about the 14 months of daily sessions and the report she'd written and the morning she'd come in to find he'd been cleared for deployment and the particular quality of her resignation letter, which she'd written in 40 minutes because she'd known exactly what she needed to say and had not wanted to give herself time to say it differently. She thought about 3 years of side entrances and cold pasta, and the way Brianna Marsh said her name like a mild inconvenience, and the way Harold in room 22 said lucky dogs. She thought about 12 Belgian Malinois forming a circle in a hospital anteroom at 8:40 in the morning. And she thought about a network of people who had looked at her and seen not a threat but a gap. A person who could be discredited, whose contributions could be erased, whose silence could be built into the architecture of something that should never have been built. They had been wrong about the gap. She heard the roof access door open behind her. She didn't turn around until she heard the footsteps stop. 2 sets, which was more than she'd expected. Marcus Vale. And beside him, Deputy Director Ferris. "We looked for you downstairs," Marcus said. "I needed air." "I know." He came to stand beside her at the parapet. He looked at the city the same way she had, not like someone seeing it fresh, but like someone who had looked at a lot of difficult things over a long career and had learned that looking at the sky sometimes helped you put them in the right order. The name from the Keller restructuring office came in 10 minutes ago. She turned to look at him. "Paul Ventry," he said. He was Deputy Administrator of the Restructuring Oversight Committee. He had system access to the federal personnel database through his role, and he maintained that access through a security failure after he transitioned out of the committee. He paused. "He placed the misconduct filing, and he was the one who flagged your name to the network when my file entered the review process." "Did you know him?" "I worked with him, briefly, during the restructuring." "Was he involved in the decision about Gideon's deployment?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "That was a separate failure. A genuine one. Poor judgment, insufficient review, my accountability and 2 other people's. Not a network. Not a deliberate act." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to make it easier. It's just important that you know the difference." She looked back at the city. "I know the difference," she said. "I've known it for 4 years." He nodded. Ferris spoke for the first time. "Ms. Vale, I'd like to formally advise you that the Office of Federal Personnel Compliance has completed its expedited review of the misconduct filing in your record. The filing has been expunged, and a notation of its fraudulent origin has been added." She held out a single sheet of paper. "This is your copy of the formal clearance." Hannah took it. She looked at it. The language was bureaucratic and clean and correct, and it said, in careful official words, that the thing placed in her record to reduce her to a problem someone had already solved was not real and had never been real, and the record now said so. She folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said. "There's a second document," Ferris said. She held out another sheet. "Director Vale's recommendation has been formally approved by the Joint Oversight Division, pending your acceptance. The position of lead behavioral consultant for the Federal K9 Operations Division, reinstated from the Keller mandate, is being formally offered to you." Hannah held the second sheet. She looked at Marcus. He was watching her with the careful expression of someone who had put a great deal of effort into arriving at a moment and has enough self-awareness to understand that the moment doesn't belong to them. "This doesn't fix Gideon," she said. "No," he said. "Nothing fixes Gideon. This is something different. It's not an apology. It's not meant to be. It's a recognition. They're different things. She looked at the document in her hand. Then she looked at the city. Then she looked at the parking structure below, where she'd been standing last night with an anonymous text on her phone and the fluorescence buzzing and the shape of something she hadn't yet fully understood. She understood it now. Or most of it. "I need 24 hours, she said. "Of course," Ferris said. Hannah folded the second sheet and put it in her pocket beside the first. 2 pieces of paper, side by side. One that said a lie had been told about her, and one that said a truth was being offered to her, and she'd need a day to understand what she wanted to do with both. She turned from the parapet. She was halfway to the door when she heard Mercer's voice on Marcus's radio. The words came through in the clipped, taut shorthand of a man who was maintaining professional calm over something that had just shifted. "Director Vale, we have a problem with the Ashby statement. Legal has found an inconsistency. It looks like part of the cooperative disclosure was prepared in advance, language that's almost identical to a briefing document from inside the Joint Oversight Division. A pause that had weight in it. Someone gave Elliot Ashby a copy of our internal investigation framework before his attorney arrived this morning." Marcus Vale and Ferris exchanged a look. Hannah stopped walking. "The network has someone inside the Joint Oversight Division," she said. She said it quietly, to the air, to the wall, to nobody in particular. But the words landed in the silence of the rooftop like something concrete and heavy. Mercer's voice came through the radio again. "We're running the document trail now. But if the statement was shaped by inside knowledge, then we don't know what's real in the statement and what was placed there to redirect the investigation," Ferris said. Her voice had gone flat in the way it went flat when she was processing something that required her full bandwidth. Hannah turned back around. "The 3 other witnesses," she said, "the ones at the other 2 facilities who were moved this morning because of the information from Elliot Ashby's statement." Ferris was already reaching for her phone. "If the statement was shaped," Hannah said, "then the relocation protocols for the other 2 witnesses came from compromised information." The look on Ferris's face told Hannah what she needed to know before Ferris said a word. The witnesses had been moved 6 hours ago, to locations determined by the investigation's internal framework, the framework that someone inside the Joint Oversight Division may have given to Elliot Ashby before he opened his mouth. Ferris was already on the phone before Hannah finished the sentence. The call lasted 40 seconds. Ferris said 9 words into it, 7 of them operational, 2 of them the kind of language that federal officials used when the situation had upgraded itself without permission. And then she was moving toward the roof access door with the specific velocity of someone for whom the next 10 minutes were going to determine the next several years. Marcus followed her. Hannah stood on the rooftop for exactly 3 seconds after they left. Then she followed too, because standing on a roof while the thing she'd identified was unfolding below her was not something she was capable of doing, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise somewhere around hour 14 of the previous day. The 4th floor had transformed by the time she came through the stairwell door. The measured, procedural energy of the morning briefing had compressed into something tighter and faster. People on phones, people on radios, the particular quality of coordinated urgency that was different from panic, precisely because everyone in the corridor was trained, and because training, when it was good, meant you moved faster when the stakes went up rather than slower. Mercer was at the center of it. He saw her immediately, which told her he'd been watching for her, and he crossed the corridor in 8 steps with his tablet in his hand. "Both relocation sites are being held pending verification," he said. "Neither witness has been moved into the interior of the new facility yet. They're in transport vehicles at the perimeter. We have about a 20-minute window before the transport teams need a decision." "What does the document trail show?" "The internal framework document, the one that matches language in Ashby's statement, was accessed from inside the Joint Oversight Division at 11:47 p.m. last night. 4 people had active sessions in the system at that hour." He turned the tablet toward her. "We've cleared 3 of them. The 4th," she looked at the name on the screen, Senior Investigator Dara Okonkwo, the woman who had been sitting in the morning briefing, quiet, watchful, the specific stillness of federal seniority. Hannah thought about that stillness now and understood it differently. Not the composure of authority, but the composure of someone who knew exactly what was in the room and had already calculated the angles. "She was in this briefing," Hannah said. "She was in every briefing. She had full operational access. She knew the relocation protocols before they were issued. Mercer's voice was even. The evenness had a quality she recognized from yesterday, professional control over something that was not a professional feeling. She's been with the Joint Oversight Division for 11 years. Where is she now? That's the problem, he said. She left the building at 10:54 a.m., logged as a scheduled field visit. She's not answering her phone. Hannah processed this. She knew Ashby's statement was going to be challenged. She was in the room when the inconsistency was found. No, Mercer said. The inconsistency was found by legal at 11:20. She left at 10:54. She didn't wait for the inconsistency to be found. She left because she knew the statement would eventually be challenged regardless, and she'd already done what she needed to do. Hannah looked at the tablet. The relocation sites, they're compromised because she helped design the relocation protocol. If the network knows where the witnesses were moved, then the relocation solved nothing, Mercer said. Worse than nothing. It put them somewhere the network expected them to be. He was already turning back toward the coordination desk. She followed without being asked. Us. The next 40 minutes were the most procedurally complicated of Hannah's professional life, and she had spent 5 years working in a classified federal facility, so that was not a low bar. She was not an investigator. She was not armed. She had a nursing badge, an inactive clearance that was currently being reevaluated, and 2 pieces of paper in her jacket pocket. What she had that was useful in the next 40 minutes was not credentials. It was pattern recognition and the specific quality of attention that came from years of reading behavioral signals in environments where everyone else was looking at something else. Pell ran the coordination. Ferris managed the communication chain to the transport teams. Mercer worked the document trail with 2 technical analysts. Hannah sat at a corner of the coordination table with a printed copy of the relocation protocol and read it the way she read a behavioral log, not looking for what it said, but looking for the shape of what it was designed to produce. She found it at the 17-minute mark. The secondary verification step, she said. She said it to the room, not loudly, but with the particular quality of voice she used when she was certain about something. In the relocation protocol, if the primary site is flagged as compromised, the team is supposed to go to a secondary site chosen from a pre-approved list. The list is in the protocol annex. Pell looked up. That's standard. The annex in this document is different from the standard annex, Hannah said. She laid the document flat on the table and pointed. This list has 7 sites. The standard federal relocation annex has 12. 5 sites are missing, and 2 of the 7 that remain aren't on the standard list at all. She looked at Pell. If the primary sites are flagged, which they will be, once the transport teams get the order to hold, the protocol directs the teams to a secondary list that Okonkwo modified. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then Pell picked up his radio and gave the transport teams the order that meant don't go anywhere, don't follow the secondary protocol, wait for direct instruction. The order went out at 11:58 a.m. At 12:03 p.m., confirmation came back that both transport teams were stationary and secure. The witnesses were in the vehicles, unharmed, waiting. The room did not cheer. Federal operations rooms did not cheer. But there was a collective shift in the quality of the air, the specific decompression that happened when a very bad outcome had been routed around, not cleanly, not without cost, but successfully. Mercer looked at Hannah across the table. She looked back at him. She was aware that her hands were shaking slightly under the table and that she was not going to mention this to anyone in this room. The modified protocol, Pell said. He was looking at her with the particular attention of a very senior person who was recalibrating something important. How did you catch it? It didn't match, she said. The structure looked right, but the content was slightly off. When something looks correct but reads wrong, you check the underlying framework. She paused. It's the same principle as reading a behavioral log. The surface pattern can be constructed. The underlying logic is harder to fake. Pell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right," in the tone of someone filing something in a category that would be relevant later. Dara Okonkwo was apprehended at 2:17 p.m. at a private airfield 40 minutes outside the city. Hannah was not there for this. She learned about it the way she'd been learning things all day. In pieces, through Mercer, through the radio traffic she could hear from the coordination room. The arrest was clean, which she was told meant no resistance, no incident, Just a woman sitting in a small terminal with a carry-on bag and a boarding pass for a connecting flight to a country with limited extradition alignment, who stood up when federal agents came through the door and said nothing at all. The nothing was, in its own way, the most complete acknowledgement available. By 3 p.m., the full scope of the network had been mapped to a degree that would take months of legal proceedings to fully resolve, but whose outline was now visible. 7 individuals across 4 federal agencies, 18 months of active operation, 3 target witnesses, and a structure built specifically around the gaps in the federal K9 behavioral program. Gaps that had been engineered, not accidental, created by influencing the Keller restructuring to remove the people most likely to read the warning signs. Her, specifically. The network had spent 18 months building a plan that depended on her not being in the room. And then Atlas had walked into an anteroom and put his head against her sternum, and the plan had come apart in 48 hours. She thought about that sitting in the coordination room at 3:15 p.m., with the noise of the investigation continuing around her. She thought about it not with satisfaction. Satisfaction felt like the wrong shape for it, but with something more complicated. The recognition that the thing they'd tried to use against her was the same thing that had undone them. The absence they'd engineered had become the presence that destroyed the plan. A dog had remembered her, and she had been paying attention. But at 4 p.m., Lowell Ashby resigned as director of Riverside Federal Medical Center. The resignation was formal and immediate and occurred in his office on the 3rd floor with legal counsel present, and the specific quiet of an ending that everyone in the building could feel without being told about it. He was not charged with wrongdoing. There was no evidence he had known what his son was doing, and the investigation found none. But he was a man whose son had been an operative inside his own facility, and the position was no longer tenable in a way that didn't require formal accusation to be true. Hannah heard about the resignation from Brianna Marsh, who came to find her in the coordination room at 4:20 with the expression of someone who had been absorbing a very complicated day in pieces and had arrived at an unexpected peace. "Ashby resigned," Brianna said. "I heard. The whole hospital is... people don't know what to..." She stopped. She looked at Hannah in the way she'd been looking at her since this morning, the recalibrating look, but deeper now. More of the surface had come away. "How did you know? Yesterday morning. How did you know something was wrong?" "I didn't," Hannah said. "I just understood what Atlas was doing. The knowing came from him." "But you understood it when nobody else did." "Yes." Brianna was quiet. Then, "I've been working beside you for 3 years." "I know." "I didn't know any of this, any of it. The Keller program, the protocols, the..." "You didn't ask," Hannah said. It came out without edge, which was the most honest version of it. Brianna absorbed this. It landed the way true things land. Not comfortably, but solidly. "No," she said. "I didn't." She looked at the floor, then at Hannah. "I made assumptions about what you could do based on how you spoke. And I was wrong. And I'm sorry." She said the sorry differently this time than she had this morning. It was still incomplete, the way apologies always are when they're for something structural and long-standing, but it was more honest. "That's the full thing I should have said this morning and didn't." Hannah looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it the right way. It was not forgiveness, but it was a door, and doors were how things started." The formal session happened at 5 p.m. in the 4th floor conference room with the same 14 people who had been there in the morning, plus several additional figures from the Joint Oversight Division's Emergency Oversight Team who had flown in during the afternoon to begin the internal review of Okonkwo's tenure. Pell ran it. He was efficient and precise, and he covered the operational summary in 12 minutes, during which Hannah sat in the same chair she'd occupied that morning and tried to look like someone who had slept more than 4 hours. Then he put her name on the record. He didn't do it dramatically. He did it the way he did everything, as an operational fact, stated plainly, with appropriate precision. The identification of the behavioral anomaly in Atlas, the connection of that anomaly to the maintenance window, the discovery of the listening devices, the intervention in the witness's cardiac event, the identification of the modified relocation protocol. These are the contributions of Hannah Vale, RN, former lead behavioral consultant at the Keller Recovery and Rehabilitation Facility, currently a trauma support nurse at this institution. He looked at her. The formal record reflects this accurately and in full. She held his gaze. She didn't look away from it. Additionally, Pell continued, the Joint Oversight Division is formally recommending that the Federal K9 Operations Division reinstate the Keller Behavioral Framework as the operational standard, and that the position of lead behavioral consultant be recreated and filled as an urgent operational priority. He looked at Ferris. Deputy Director. Ferris opened a folder. The formal offer of the position has been made to Ms. Vale and is pending her response. She looked at Hannah. Do you have a response? The room was quiet. Hannah thought about the parking structure at 1:28 a.m. She thought about the side entrance and 4 extra minutes and a container of cold pasta. She thought about Gideon because she always thought about Gideon, and she thought about Atlas with his head against her sternum and the 12 dogs in a circle and Harold saying lucky dogs with his eyes already closing. She thought about a network of people who had spent 18 months building something around her absence. She thought about what it meant that the absence was the vulnerability, that the thing they'd feared most, the thing they'd worked hardest to prevent, was not her presence. It was her attention, the particular quality of it, the fact that she listened to things other people had decided weren't worth listening to. Yes, she said, I accept. No one in the room cheered. This was a federal operations briefing, not a ceremony. But there was that shift again, the decompression, the slight change in the weight of the air. And Mercer, seated 2 chairs down, made a small involuntary movement that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. She was back on the trauma floor by 5:45. Not because anyone asked her to be, because she had 2 charts to close out, and a patient in room 22 who would notice if she didn't check in before she left, and because the floor was still running and patients still needed things regardless of what had happened on the 4th floor. She finished the charts. She knocked on room 22. Harold was awake, phone on the table now rather than in use, looking at the window with the mild, assessing expression of a man who had been doing a lot of thinking. You look different, he said when she came in. I've had a long day. Different than tired. He studied her. Lighter, like something got resolved. She looked at him. How's your pain level? 4. Down from yesterday. He waved a hand. The maple. I've been thinking about it. The Japanese maple. It comes back every year because it's not trying to be anything other than what it is. It's not trying to be bigger than it is or faster than it is. It just does what it does, very well, in the right conditions. He paused. It took 6 years to get the conditions right. Hannah stood beside the bed. Outside the room, the floor moved with its usual organized noise, gurneys, voices, the buzz of fluorescence that she had spent 3 years telling herself she'd stopped hearing. She heard them now. She let herself hear them. I'm going to be leaving this floor, she said. A new position. I don't know when exactly. Ah, he nodded slowly. The dogs. Yes, the dogs. Good, he said simply. That's where you should be. She adjusted the call button placement on his bed rail so it was easier to reach. Small, practical. The kind of thing that mattered and didn't require a conversation about it. Thank you, Harold, she said. For what? She didn't answer that. She turned off the extra light above his bed and left the room. Mercer found her at the nurse's station at 6:15, which was no longer surprising. He appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision and waited rather than interrupting, which she had noticed he did when he thought the timing mattered. She initialed the last chart and turned around. Okonkwo gave a partial statement, he said. Enough to confirm the network's recruitment of Elliot Ashby 14 months ago. She's been their asset in the Joint Oversight Division for at least 2 years. The full accounting is going to take months. Paul Ventry, she said, the one who placed the filing in my record. In custody as of an hour ago. The charge list is long. Good. She meant it simply, without drama. The word carried exactly its own weight. The 3 witnesses are being relocated under a completely rebuilt protocol. Different sites, different team, different authorization chain. He paused. They're safe. I know, she said. I'd have heard otherwise. He smiled at that, a brief, actual smile, the first unguarded one she'd seen from him in 2 days. It changed his face in a way that was interesting to observe. The position, he said. When you're ready to start, the division will work around your transition timeline. There's no pressure on the dates. There are 12 dogs who've been operating under a degraded behavioral framework for an unknown period of time, Hannah said. There's pressure on the dates. Fair point. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She looked at the nurse's station, the clipboards, the monitors, the coffee machine that had never once produced coffee worth the effort, the particular institutional geography of a place where she'd spent 3 years becoming invisible by degrees. She looked at it with the specific clarity that comes when you're leaving somewhere and you let yourself see it fully for the first time, because the cost of seeing it fully is finally lower than the cost of not seeing it. "Brianna," she said, not loudly. Brianna was at the far end of the station. Brianna looked up. "The night rotation is going to be short on trauma support until you backfill my position," Hannah said. "Dr. Osei's team is going to need additional support coverage for the secure wing during the transition. You might want to get ahead of that." Brianna held her gaze for a moment. "I'll handle it," she said. Hannah nodded. That was enough. She walked out through the front entrance. Oh. The formal recognition ceremony was 3 weeks later. It was not a large event. Federal recognition events rarely were. A conference room, a small number of invited personnel, documentation, and formal statement. But Pell was there, and Ferris, and Marcus Vale, and Mercer, and Dr. Osei, who had been cited separately for her management of the witness's medical care under compromised conditions, and who shook Hannah's hand beforehand with the particular grip of someone who had been through something with you. And the dogs were there. All 12 of them, in the corridor outside the conference room, in their working gear, with their handlers. Atlas at the front. She saw them before she went in. She stopped walking. Atlas looked at her. That calm, complete attention. That checking look. She put her hand on the side of his face. He leaned into it, just slightly, just for a second, and then pulled back into his professional posture the way he always did. Still on task, still present, still the most honest version of a living thing she had ever encountered. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm here." Inside the conference room, Pell read the formal citation. It was precise and accurate and covered, in careful official language, the sequence of events that had led from an anteroom at 8:40 a.m. to 3 protected witnesses alive and 6 federal operatives in custody and 1 compromised senior investigator awaiting trial and a behavioral framework reinstated after a 4-year absence. When he finished, he looked at Hannah and said, "Would you like to say anything?" She hadn't prepared anything. She'd thought about preparing something and decided she didn't trust prepared things for moments that deserved to be honest. She stood up. "I spent 4 years believing I'd made a choice to leave," she said. "I found out recently that other people had made choices designed to ensure I stayed gone. And I've been thinking about what that means. Not about them, but about the choice itself, about whether it was mine." She looked at the room. Mercer, Ferris, Marcus. "I think it was," she said. "Even if the conditions were engineered, I still chose to leave. I chose to stop fighting a system that wasn't listening, and I chose to go somewhere quieter and do something smaller because it felt safer than continuing to speak into a room that couldn't hear me." She paused. "I don't think that was wrong. I think that was survival. And I think survival is underrated as a form of courage." The room was quiet. "But I also think that the things that get ignored don't stop existing. The knowledge doesn't go away. The capacity doesn't disappear because someone stopped looking for it. And sometimes the room has to break down completely before the right people realize what they stopped listening to." She looked at her hands, then back up. Atlas had been trying to tell someone something for 9 days. He didn't give up. He didn't stop flagging the pattern because nobody was reading it. He just kept doing the work, with the certainty that eventually someone would understand. She stopped. She wasn't sure there was a clean ending to this thought because it wasn't a clean thought. It was a true one, and true things were rarely clean. "I'm glad I was the someone," she said. "And I'm glad I came back." She sat down. Pell said something formal and appropriate. Documents were signed, hands were shaken. The ceremony moved through its necessary stages with the procedural dignity of official recognition that had been a long time in coming. Marcus Vale approached her near the end when the room had started to break up into small conversations. "The Keller files," he said. "All of them. The original research, the training documentation, the behavioral mapping system. They're being restored to their original classification and attributed correctly." He looked at her steadily. "Your name is on them, the way it should have been from the beginning." She absorbed that. "That matters," she said. "Not to him, not exactly, just to the air, as a plain statement of fact." "I know," he said. She didn't forgive him. She hadn't said she would, and she didn't. But she looked at him and saw a man who had made a wrong call under pressure and had spent 4 years carrying it and had eventually done the only thing available to him, tried, imperfectly and late, to correct the record. That wasn't absolution. It was just what it was. "We have work to do," she said. He nodded. "Yes, we do." She went back to the hospital one more time the following morning. Not for the investigation, not for federal business. She went at 7 a.m. through the main entrance and up to room 22, where Harold was being discharged and his son had driven up to take him home. The son was loading Harold's bag into a wheelchair when Hannah appeared in the doorway. Harold's face did the thing it had been doing all week, that proprietorial, pleased recognition. "She came to say goodbye," he told his son, "the one with the dogs." "I heard," the son said. He shook Hannah's hand. "He's talked about you every time I called." "Your father is easy to talk to," she said, which was true. Harold reached out and patted her hand with the slightly uncoordinated warmth of someone post-surgery who didn't care about coordination. "You're going to go back to the dogs," he said. "Yes." "Good." He let go of her hand. "Come see the maple sometime. When it comes back next spring, you can see for yourself." She thought about a balcony planter she'd never gotten around to. She thought about an apartment 12 minutes from a hospital she was no longer going to work in and a side entrance she was no longer going to use. "I'd like that," she said. She meant it. She started the new position on a Monday. It was not ceremonious. She drove to the federal facility outside the city, badged through a security checkpoint with clearance that was no longer inactive, walked into a building that smelled of working animals and industrial cleaner, and the particular clean purposefulness of a place where people and dogs took the work seriously. Atlas was in the first training yard. He saw her before she cleared the door. His head came up the way it had through a window in a hospital corridor. That rapid, orienting attention that was different from recognition and deeper than familiarity. Something older than either. He did not break formation. He was a working dog, and he understood what formation meant and when it mattered. But his tail moved, once, twice. Hannah stopped at the edge of the yard. The morning was cold and the air smelled of coming rain, and there were 11 other dogs in various stages of drill work and a handler team that looked at her with the cautious, evaluating attention of people who'd been told someone was coming but hadn't yet determined what that meant for them. She'd been here before. Different building, different dogs, different people. The same essential weight of being looked at and not yet known. She understood that weight now in a way she hadn't 4 years ago. She understood that being unknown was not the same as being invisible, and being quiet was not the same as being absent, and the time it took her to say something had never once determined the value of what she said. She knew things worth knowing, and she knew how to teach them. "All right," she said to the room, to the handlers, to the 12 dogs in the morning cold. She said it without a stutter. Not because the stutter was gone, it wasn't and it wouldn't be, but because this morning, in this yard, the word came out the way she meant it. Steady, clear, certain. "Let's get to work." Atlas sat at the edge of his station and looked at her with that complete ancient attention. The attention that had always seen her exactly as she was, never as what other people decided she must be. And in the gray morning light, with 12 working dogs around her and the smell of rain coming in from the west, Hannah Vale stood in a yard she had every right to stand in and felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly the right size. Not larger than she was, not smaller, just herself. Finally, fully, in the right room. The work was waiting. She had already begun.